The last week of Jesus' life here upon this earth, we're down to last week we studied the betrayal and the arrest of Christ. And so this week we're going to be looking at a lesson that involves the trial of Jesus. Now, there were multiple trials of Jesus that took place, so what we're focusing on particularly in this study is the Jewish trial of Jesus Christ. And this is one of those lessons. We're actually supposed to cover this and Peter's denial too. And the more material and the more study that I put together on this particular point, I thought, well, we're just going to spend the whole week on this. And then we're going next week, since we only have the one lesson in the all-in-one, or the one main lesson, I guess I should say. We'll look at Peter's denial. But let's think about this Jewish trial of Jesus. Talk about some of the things that took place and some of the things that, to me, helped me greater appreciate, what Christ was willing to go through for us. And these trials are what we'll find as we study through these trials. They're one of the greatest, well, probably the greatest. I'll just say it is the greatest miscarriage of justice or injustice that had ever taken place. So we have to understand that they weren't really much of a trial. And in fact, we're going to talk about and study about how basically Jesus didn't have a chance whenever he went through the legal, use that term loosely, the legal procedures of his day and age, because everything that happened in them was illegal. And so it's just amazing what he was willing to endure for us. I invite you to take out your Bibles, though. Turn over. We're going to be looking mainly at Matthew chapter 26, but I'm going to actually start in John chapter 18. I mentioned, as we looked at last week, that Jesus has been arrested. He's been bound. And so we read in John 18, beginning in verse 12, it says, "Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year." So what we learn is that after Jesus is arrested, that the first stop that is made in this process of what I would deem the Jewish trial is actually appearing before a man by the name of Annas. Now, do a little bit of historical study about Annas. Why would Jesus be taken there first? Got to understand some of the background behind this guy. He was probably the most influential Jewish person of that day and age. I'm talking about politically and religiously and socially. Annas was a guy who had served as the high priest a number of years, about 20 years before this time. He'd spent a stint of about 10 years as serving as the high priest here. And what you have to understand about the Jewish mindset is they understood the law of God, that when a man became a high priest, he stayed the high priest until he died. Okay, but the Romans came in and they said, no, this guy's not going to be high priest anymore. We're going to appoint a high priest. And the Jews thought, well, you might appoint a high priest, but we all know who the real high priest is. That's this guy back here, because he hasn't died yet. And so even though he was removed from office by the Roman politicians, the Jews still looked at him as one of their key figures politically and socially and religiously. And he had a lot of influence because he had been the high priest. Also interesting to study his bloodline. He had 5 sons, and each of them during their lifetime at some point served as a high priest too. And then we're reading here about Annas, and what we learn about this is that his daughter has married the current high priest. So he's basically this guy who has this wealth of power and control at his fingertips, and has for a great matter of time. So understand, first of all, that Jesus is appearing before one of the most influential Jewish, politically speaking and socially speaking, people of that day and age. You also have to understand this, because Annas was so tied, because his fingers were all in the high priesthood, he would have been heavily involved in the temple too. That was probably one of his main areas, kind of overseeing the temple or controlling it. Jesus had cleansed the temple 2 different times. And so he'd upset the temple business at least twice here, and Annas didn't really appreciate that in any way or want anything to do with him because of it. So the question becomes this: why does he go to Annas first? And I think the answer is either maybe one of two or maybe both of these. I think, first of all, Annas is, has got all this experience, and he's probably trying to help his son-in-law nail down what do we go to charge Jesus with? Because that's really the question. What can we do to get Jesus put to death? What can we charge him with? And so maybe Annas is kind of feeling things out, before the official trial and gathering some information so he can give Caiaphas, the official high priest or Roman high priest, some insight as to what he needed to do. The second reason I think would also be this: they're trying to bolster Jewish support. And so how can you bolster Jewish support? Well, get the guy who is the most influential Jewish figure in that day and age, get him on the side of putting Jesus to death. Maybe if you got him on your side, maybe if people say, well, he went to Annas first and Annas examined him and talked about him, then they might be a little more open to receiving, this guy must have been bad. This guy Jesus must have done something really wrong in order for this to happen. Now, as you read through John chapter 18, here's some things that we learn about. This is Annas' intention to kind of examine Christ. But in verse 19, John records this. He says, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resorted, and in secret I have said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I have said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of that evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Then Annas sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. So as Jesus is standing before Annas, here's Annas, and he starts his line of questioning. It begins asking him about his disciples. He says, who are your disciples? I want you to tell me about them. And then he says, I want you to tell me about your teaching. Expound to me some of the things that you've been out here teaching. Well, understand this. He's basically asking Jesus to incriminate himself, isn't he? Tell me what you taught and tell me what you're doing here. And Jesus is saying, first of all, you know what I taught. Okay, you don't need me to tell you. You know who my disciples are. Okay, you're not out here genuinely trying to gather information. You already know the answer to all these questions. You know who hangs around with me. You understand my group. You know what I've taught because I did it publicly. I didn't go out here and teach one thing publicly and then behind closed doors teach a completely different thing. Everybody is aware of my teaching. Everybody is aware of my disciples. And so Annas, or I guess one of the soldiers maybe, is more agitated by Jesus' answer than maybe Annas himself. But he slaps him across the face. And he says, well, where did you learn to speak so disrespectfully to a high priest? And Jesus said, tell me where I'm wrong. Am I lying to you or am I telling you the truth? Y'all know who my disciples are? Do y'all know what I've been teaching out here? So basically, Jesus is refusing to give Annas any ammo. Okay, he's not going to allow him to go out here and gather all this information and then hand it over into the hands of Caiaphas and say, okay, now this is what we convict Jesus of. So what happens? Well, that pre-trial's over. Annas understands I'm not going to get anywhere. This guy is not going to answer any of my questions. He's not officially obligated to do so. And so the Bible says, get him to the high priest. Get him to Caiaphas where we can put him on real trial and, get him talking. And so that's what happens. Now, that's really one of the main points you could write down in this Jewish trial of Jesus, but I didn't want to write an introduction, so I was kind of lazy to just use it as my introduction. But that was Jesus before Annas. Let's talk about what happened to Jesus in this Jewish trial at the house of Caiaphas. You can turn over to Matthew chapter 26 now. That's basically where we're going to spend the rest of our time this morning. But here's what we read about in verse 57. It says, "And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest," the Roman high priest, understand that, "where the scribes and the elders were assembled." So the first thing that happens is he appears before Annas, not an official Jewish trial, kind of a pre-trial, you could say, illegal pre-trial, but nonetheless a pre-trial. And now he's going to the house of Caiaphas, where it kind of, I don't know, you might say this first trial is kind of unofficial because they meet again in the morning to kind of seal things up, but it's really part of the main trial that takes place in front of the Jews. So where does he go? Well, he goes to the house of Caiaphas. We learn a little bit earlier in Matthew chapter 26 that the house that Caiaphas lived in was actually a palace, the palace of the high priest. We might call it a mansion today. Some people, when they read the story of Christ and this trial, they say there's no way he could have gotten from Annas to Caiaphas, in that short of a time. But I imagine, listen, if Caiaphas lived in a mansion and it was near the place where the main religious activity was happening, I imagine Annas lived there too. Now, I can't verify that by the scripture, but I just imagine they probably lived in the same house or mansion. I wouldn't say it's probably that there weren't possibilities, that there were interrogation rooms within this mansion where the high priest could kind of take people and, talk to them in private or get to the bottom of matters, but there's a lot of possible explanation. Just be aware of that particular line of reasoning. Now, who's there? Well, in verse 57, we know Caiaphas is there, right? He's the Roman high priest. But it also says the scribes and the elders have already assembled there too. Now, Matthew mentions, if you back up in this chapter, I want to draw your attention back to the very first part of this chapter. Who was the group of people that decided they were going to kill Jesus? Well, if you look at verse 1 in Matthew 26, Jesus just finishes up all these things that he's been teaching his disciples. And in verse 2, he tells them, 2 days, the feast, the Passover feast is coming. I'm going to be betrayed and I'm going to be crucified. I don't know if you can remember way back when we studied this. But when we did, one of the things that I brought out is in verse 3, it says, "Then assembled together." At the very time Jesus was telling his disciples about his betrayal and his crucifixion, his death, at that very moment there was a group of people that were assembling, plotting the death of Christ. Who were those people? Well, Matthew records there in Matthew 26 and verse 3, "Then assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people." Now notice where they are. "Under the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas." What were they doing there? "And they consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him." You notice who's here in this group? Caiaphas the high priest, Matthew 26:57, the scribes and the elders. The very people who had assembled together to plot Jesus' death. And that's what it was. How are we going to kill this guy? How are we going to put him to death? They gave the money for his arrest. The men bring them to them. And so the point that I'm trying to make to you is this. Can you call that a trial? I mean, when I think about a trial, I actually think a guy's got a fair chance to be innocent, don't you? He's got a chance to be pronounced innocent or guilty. This was no trial. Okay, this had already been predetermined. They had already plotted together. We're going to get Jesus in front of us. We're going to figure out how we're going to kill him. And so the life of Christ was on this line. If you need to know, John 18 and verse 14 tells us everything that we need to know about Caiaphas. It says this about him there. It says that Jesus was led to his house, but then John says this, "Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people." Okay, Caiaphas had already told the Jews. Jews had said, "What are we going to do with this guy Jesus? He's causing us trouble." Caiaphas says we need to kill him. Okay, it's better for us as a nation to stay intact and the Romans don't come down here and, kill all of us. We need to kill him so that we don't all have to die. And so Caiaphas had already made that decision in his mind too. This was a night meeting. Why is that important? Because when you study the Mishnah, which basically tells us about some of the laws that Jews had in order, especially when it came to court rulings and things like that, one of the laws within the Mishnah was no person was to be tried at night. Every trial that took place had to take place during daylight. They've already violated so many laws, but again, to call it a trial really isn't even making it fair. Because in my mind, they're not there for a trial. They're just there looking for some kind of evidence to base an accusation on that's going to lead to the capital death of Jesus Christ. So that's what it's all about. Make no mistake from the beginning. And the more you study it, the clearer it becomes. Okay, so how do they do that? Well, the next thing that we read about in this trial are false witnesses. If you go to Matthew 26, again, verse 59, here's this same group that we've been talking about. And it says, now the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus. Okay, these guys that are putting him on trial, they're out here on their own, and what are they looking for? They're looking for somebody to say something about Jesus that's not true. They're looking for false witnesses. Why? Verse 59, to put him to death. They got a problem, though, in verse 60. It says, but they found none, yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. So Matthew tells us a little bit more information here. We've read about the high priest Caiaphas, he's present. We have the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes, they're all present too. But Matthew says this in verse 59. Now you have all the council. Okay, what is he talking about there, the council? That's the Sanhedrin council. That's the main group of Jewish leaders who were kind of in charge of all the Jewish affairs, religiously and politically and socially. That was the court to which people went. If you had a problem or if you had a case, you went before these people to make your case. They made a ruling and a decision upon that. Understand something important here. You might think, well, why didn't they just kill Jesus right then and there? Because they didn't have the authority. Okay, a number of years before, Rome had taken away the power of the Jewish Sanhedrin Council to pronounce death upon somebody. So they could make their ruling, and if they ruled a person was worthy of death or capital punishment, then they had to give it into the hands of the Romans, and the Romans had to ultimately be the ones who say, okay, yeah, this guy deserves to die. We'll carry out this capital punishment. But all this council has now assembled. I'm going to interpret that word all very loosely. Here's what you have to understand. There were 70 members in the Sanhedrin Council, 71 if you counted the high priest. High priest was kind of the guy who was in charge and oversaw the whole process. You didn't always have to have all 70 members present in order to convict somebody of a crime. Again, if you read the Mishnah, kind of the official Jewish law book, so to speak, they said in a matter of personal injury, if you're going to law because somebody injured you personally, or theft, somebody stole something from you, you only needed 3 members of the council to get a conviction. Okay, you didn't have to have all 70 members there. You didn't have to have all of them vote in favor. When it came to capital punishment, a little bit more of an increase, but the number increased to 23. So you had to have 23 members of the Jewish Sanhedrin Council say, yeah, this guy is worthy of death. That might explain why, well, I don't know how far I should get into it. Maybe Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea might not be at this council. But they didn't need every council member to vote in favor of it. They just needed 23. So I think they probably got some hand-picked guys, that they've set in these positions. And now Jesus is appearing before them. So what are they looking for? They're looking for somebody who will say something about Jesus that's not true. Okay, we got to convict him. We need somebody to lie and make a statement so that we can, have some accusation to pin on him and then say this accusation is worthy of death. What's the problem? It's not the number of witnesses, right? Matthew talks about it. Mark talks about it. You got a lot of people. There were many false witnesses. There were guys who were out here saying, yeah, I'll tell you what Jesus said. or I'll tell you what he taught, or I'll tell you what he did. Now, again, I want to emphasize, they aren't objectively going out into the community and saying, what is this guy Jesus like? You know, they're out here purposely looking for people who are going to lie about Christ. That's who they want. And so they're searching through these false witnesses. This guy says, yeah, I'll testify. This guy says, yeah, I'll testify. Well, what are you going to say? I'll say this. You know what the problem is? Nobody's witness agreed together. They would say things about Jesus, but you couldn't find two people who would say, yes, this is the same way. Well, tell me this story. Well, this is my version of how the story goes. Well, that doesn't jive, does it? This guy said this happened, and this guy said, Jesus said this. So they got a problem right on their hands. Now, I'm not going to read Deuteronomy 19. You can look that up. But in Deuteronomy 19, it talks about, first of all, you have to understand this. Law of Moses, this is Jewish law. That's what Jesus is going through right now. Law of Moses said you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses to put a man to death. And you can't put a man to death based upon one person's word. You got to have at least 2 people who are going to say the same thing. Problem was, couldn't find 2 people who said the same thing. And so they're in a predicament here. Deuteronomy 19 also talks about how if a person comes forward to bear witness of somebody to help convict them of a crime, and they're found out to be a liar, whatever was supposed to happen to that person on trial was to happen to that false witness. So let me just emphasize this at this point here. If the Jews can't find 2 guys who are going to say the same thing, what would you deduce from that? Or if 2 guys or 20 guys come forward and they all say, I got something to say, or I saw this, or I heard this, and you say, well, that's not what this guy said over here. You say, something's off here, right? Maybe they're just talking to be talking. Maybe they don't like the guy who's on trial. So what should happen to them? Whatever was supposed to happen to Christ. But you know what happened to these guys? Nothing. Not a thing. This isn't about law. Again, this isn't about a fair trial. It's about killing Christ. That's what the whole process is about. Mark says this, Mark 14:55-56, chief priests and all the council sought for witnesses against Jesus to put him to death and found none, for many bear false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. So you might be sitting there saying, if you didn't have 2 people who could say the same thing about Jesus, how did they convict him of a crime and put him to death? Well, that's the next point. If you think I'm going to cover all these today, breathe a sigh of relief. We're going to stop after this one, okay? It's not an eternal sermon. It's a long one, but not an eternal one. Destroying and rebuilding the temple. Matthew says this, Matthew 26, second part of verse 60. He says, at the last came 2 false witnesses. Okay, we got 2 guys. And here's what they say. This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Sound worthy of death? Finally, out of this pack of liars, right? They find 2 guys who say the same thing. And so they say, all right, we got our 2 witnesses. We got 2 guys who agree. And they're saying the same thing. And here's what they heard him say, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So, what are they referring to? Well, if you go back through Jesus' ministry, way back at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John chapter 2, they're referring to a statement that he made before some Jews. He just cleansed the temple, and they said, give us a sign, or what sign are you going to show us that you have the authority to do something like this? And so Jesus says, way back there in John chapter 2, in verse 19, he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Notice the Jews' reaction in verse 20. Then the Jews said, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? John makes this commentary for us, though, in verse 21. But he spake of the temple of his body. Did he really say he would destroy the physical temple in Jerusalem and then he would rebuild it in 3 days? No, that's not what he said. Now, understand this saying was kind of hard when he talked about I'll destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days. It was hard for his disciples to understand. They didn't fully grasp it, but it was easy for his enemies to twist and manipulate that statement. And that's what they did. They took it and they applied it to the literal temple in Jerusalem. John tells us he wasn't talking about the literal temple in Jerusalem. He was talking about the temple of God, his body as the temple of God. And so they read and they decipher and they find these two guys and they twist their statements to use it to make Jesus saying something that he never really said. And so they've said, we've got this speck that we can base all this evidence on and work through it to convict Jesus of capital punishment. Now, there were, I think about some of the statements that Jesus made over his life, and I can think of a lot more that they could a lot better ones that they probably could have used than this one to try to convict a man of death. For instance, in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 6, Jesus told the Jews on the Sabbath, remember when he healed a man on the Sabbath? They were questioning him about, how can you violate the law of Moses? How can you do something that's so disrespectful in a sacred place like the temple? And Jesus made the statement here. He said, in this place, there is one who is greater than the temple. You know what Jesus was telling them there? When he was confronted about breaking the laws, the sacred Sabbath laws that they had in the house of God, Jesus said, I own the temple. I make the laws here, okay? So I can do whatever I want to do. This is my house. I'm greater than the temple itself. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a little better statement maybe to base an accusation on. But there were things like that all through the ministry of Jesus. What's interesting to me, if you read Acts chapter 6, you read about Stephen. And the way that Stephen was convicted of death by the Sanhedrin Council was basically the same way Jesus was convicted of death. And remember, Stephen said some things to the people. They didn't much appreciate him or what he had to say about anything, especially when it came to their history. But if you go over to Acts chapter 6 and you read verse 13, here's what it says. These are, again, the elders and the scribes and the chief people. These are the same group of people we're reading about Jesus' trial. They bring him to council in verse 12, and they set up false witnesses, which said, this man ceaseth not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place, the temple, and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and change the customs which Moses delivered unto us. You know what happened to Stephen, right? He was convicted of blasphemy, and he was stoned to death. Capital punishment was carried out upon him. But why were they so adamant about this statement being used? Because it was about the temple. And the temple, to the Jewish nation, the temple represented whatever the law of Moses stood for. I mean, if you were talking bad about the temple, you were talking bad about the law of Moses. If you did something against the temple, you were doing something against the law of Moses. If you destroyed the temple, you were destroying the law of Moses. And so they're going to use this accusation to pin against Jesus, or use his words to pin against him and to lead to his trial. Tonight, come back with us tonight, Lord willing, and we'll look at Jesus' reaction and how this trial ultimately spills out. I was thinking about, as I put this lesson together, how do you apply this in a practical way today? We just studied about this trial of Jesus. And to me, the thing that I gleaned over as I sifted through it this week just gave me a greater appreciation of the injustice that Jesus was willing to endure for me. I mean, he didn't have to do that. Didn't help him in any way. Didn't lift him any higher than he already was. And how many times, if that had been us, how many times would we have just said, you know what, I don't have to go through this. I don't have to endure this. Enough is enough. This is ridiculous. This isn't even a trial. I'm not going to do it. But he did it for us, didn't he? He did it so that we could be saved. And so maybe this week, just think about that. Think about, have a greater appreciation. Have a greater appreciation for the things that Jesus was willing to endure in order to get us to heaven. Maybe there's one here this morning, though,